Good afternoon, everyone. Can you guys hear me okay? I don't even know if the thing really works. All right. Welcome. And we are here today to talk about the continuing exploration of understanding the financial market crisis. And we're bringing to you a discussion regarding the ongoing downspin in the financial market titled Fannie, Freddie, and the CRA, a case of political fraud. Recently, we have entered a new stage of the financial crisis, the ritual assigning of blame. It began with the congressional roasting of Lehman Brothers CEO Richard Flood and continued with Capitol Hill Solon's delving into the failure of AIG. On the Republican side of Congress, in the right-wing financial media, there's a consensus emerging that the whole mess should be laid at the feet of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the failed mortgage giants, and the Community Reinvestment Act, the CRA, a law passed during the Carter administration. The CRA, which was amended in the 1990s and this decade, requires banks, which had a long, distinguished history of not making loans to minorities, to make more efforts to do so. Such efforts have recently backfired, and now finger-pointing has turned on one of the most vulnerable parties, the minorities. In further discussion of this topic, I'd like to welcome Professor Andre Douglas Cummings of West Virginia College of Law and Stephen Ramirez of Loyola University School of Law. Professor Cummings received his Juris Doctorate from Howard University. After law school, Professor Cummings worked for Kirkland and Ellis in Chicago, where he practiced complex business transactions and public securities offerings. Professor Cummings has been a professor of law at West Virginia for about 5 years and has published extensively in the areas of investor protection and racial justice. Professor Cummings has also received numerous Professor of the Year awards. Professor Stephen Ramirez comes to us from Loyola University School of Law. He received his Juris Doctorate from St. Louis University, and prior to becoming a professor, Ramirez was a partner with Robinson, Curley, and Clayton, a Chicago litigation firm where he specialized in corporate securities and bank litigation. Ramirez also served as a senior attorney for the Resolution Trust Corporation, the RTC, and as an enforcement attorney with the Securities and Exchange Commission. Coming from Washburn University School of Law, Professor Ramirez joined the law faculty at Loyola University in Chicago in 2006. Professor Ramirez has published extensively in the areas of corporate governance and financial regulation. We are honored to have both Professor Cummings and Professor Ramirez here with us today. I'd now like to turn it over to Professor Cummings. Thank you.
Thank him for that introduction. I'm delighted to be here with you, particularly delighted to have Professor Stephen Ramirez here, who is not only an expert in the field, but a good friend. Okay, so here we are. We're at the place, as Kim mentioned, where we are assigning blame for the current financial meltdown. Fingers are being pointed every which way. One finger in particular is being pointed here. It's Alan Greenspan. Just a few days, admitted, I made a mistake. You'll remember, in recent years, Alan Greenspan was probably the greatest proponent nationally for a deregulated trading environment, particularly in the derivatives trading market. Now, in Understanding the Financial Market Crisis 1, a couple of weeks ago, Professor Risch, Professor Sullivan, and I discussed credit default swaps and the very reckless trading that occurred in the over-the-counter derivatives trading market. Greenspan's admission of error was specifically that his judgment that sophisticated lenders and sophisticated investors could best manage and protect these unregulated default swaps was the best method for our economy. And clearly, I think Greenspan was wrong. He himself admits as much. Lots of fingers are being pointed there. However, it's not the only place that fingers need to be pointed. Fingers need to be pointed at failed regulators. Fingers need to be pointed at Congress that didn't have the guts to pass legislation over Greenspan's advice. Fingers need to be pointed at reckless borrowers. Fingers needed to be pointed at lots of places. But one place in particular that fingers are being pointed are at Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, the Community Reinvestment Act from 1978, and to borrowers in minority communities. And that, my friends, in my opinion, is the most nefarious finger pointing of all. I wanted to show you something that Alan Greenspan said while he was testifying before Congress to put all of this in context.
Former Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan told Congress that the current financial crisis was a very rare event and said he is shocked at the breakdown in U.S. credit markets. Greenspan appeared before the House Committee on Oversight and Reform.
We are in the midst of a once-in-a-century credit tsunami.
Greenspan said that while he had concerns in 2005 that risk was being understated, he was surprised about the current crisis.
The crisis, however, has turned out to be much broader than anything I could have imagined.
He also said that behavior by financial institutions took him by surprise.
Those of us who have looked to the self-interest of lending institutions to protect shareholders' equity, myself especially, are in a state of shocked disbelief.
Looking ahead, Greenspan says he expects to see more layoffs and a rise in unemployment.
Given the financial damage to date, I cannot see how we can avoid a significant rise in layoffs and unemployment.
Greenspan was hailed as one of the most accomplished central bankers in United States history when he retired in January 2006. However, his decision to keep interest rates low during his final years at the Fed have been blamed in part for the housing bubble crash that has led to the current deep financial crisis. Deborah Luderbeck, Reuters.
Of particular interest to me in all of this is that I was perhaps one of the lone voices back when the economy was humming in the late 90s and early 2000s to suggest that leaving these markets unregulated was a mistake. Greenspan and others felt like sophisticated investors would know enough to protect themselves against reckless risk and would protect the shareholders against it as well. As many of you know that are in my business organizations class, I wrote 2 articles suggesting that this was a mistake. That Congress needed to regulate over-the-counter derivatives trades simply because light must shine on the types of trading and complex transactions that occur in our financial markets today. And as of this moment, we are still in a situation where no light shines on these deals between sophisticated investors and the credit default swaps, and that's a mistake. The last thing that I want to mention is this. Of all the finger pointing and blaming going on, what I think Professor Ramirez will show today through some empirical studies and other evidence is that the finger pointing at CRA, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and minority borrowers is nefarious because it's such a minuscule portion of the meltdown that we're currently in. It's a blame that's inappropriate and one that I think you'll see shortly is one that is politically motivated in a way that is nothing but injurious. So with those things said, I'm really happy that Professor Ramirez is here, and I'd like to turn the time over to him.
Good afternoon. I can't tell you how honored I am to be here today great fall day in West Virginia. I want to thank Professor Cummings for setting this up and inviting me. And I want to emphasize at the beginning here that Professor Cummings was right. If you go back and you read his works, which I've read, I read them a long time ago. He was right then, he's right now. He was suggesting that the risks of deregulation as an ideology, the risks of laissez-faire as an ideology were just too high. And that sooner or later we were going to pay the cost. And I think he was prescient in identifying those risks and articulating the costs that were yet to be paid. I think it's quite clear at this point, and if there's one thing I want to point my finger at today, I'm going to point my finger at some people, but I'm going to try to keep it suppressed. But if there's one thing that we should all agree on, we can't go through life expecting easy answers to complex problems. Laissez-faire deregulation doesn't work. It didn't work in the 1930s. It didn't work in terms of the pre-Sarbanes-Oxley environment that Enron created and the failures, the corporate scandals that we had at the beginning of this century. And it hasn't worked with respect to deregulation of derivatives markets. It hasn't worked with respect to deregulation of securities markets. It hasn't worked in terms of suspending the net capital rule for the biggest investment banks. I'll show you what they did once the net capital rule was suspended. Deregulation is too easy an answer. The question isn't whether or not to regulate or deregulate. I'm not here to tell you today that regulation is the answer to everything. Clearly that's wrong too. What we have to do as lawyers, as law professors, as policymakers, is we have to think how to regulate smartly, keep the costs to a minimum, keep the benefits of regulation as high as possible. Look to history. Rely on experience. Look for empirical studies. But whatever you do, don't just be knee-jerk, deregulate, 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 or knee-jerk, regulate, regulate, regulate. It's far more complicated than that. You all are very bright young folks. You all are going to be successful lawyers. The reason why you're getting this education is because you will be able to add value with sophisticated thinking and analysis. And that's the kind of analysis and thinking that we need now in our financial markets. I think for too long, we relied too much on this deregulation mantra, and it's gotten us into an awful mess. And there's just no debating that anymore. And that's a big part of what I want to emphasize in terms of today's presentation. I want everyone to come away with one idea, and that is that deregulation, laissez-faire, is an economic dead end. And it's more complicated than that. You have to think. You have to analyze. You have to identify risks like Professor Cummings has done so well. I want to say something, too. This is not John McCain's fault. This is not the Republican Party's fault. This is not Alan Greenspan's fault. The fault that I am going to identify today is so broad and so widespread that I don't think any of us can escape responsibility on some level. We led a life built on a mountain of debt for 20 years, and that's a huge problem, folks. And it's going to be the singular economic event to define your economic lives going forward, and my economic life going forward. So I feel bad for Alan Greenspan. He worked hard. He was a sharp, sharp regulator, a very, very astute economist who made some very, very hard decisions, like after 9/11 and after the Twin Towers came down and the stock market had to be shut down. Remember those god-awful days? Well, Alan Greenspan decided to stimulate our economy, and every economist I recall agreed that that was an appropriate policy action at the time. It turned out that it added to our mountain of debt. It turned out that it created a bubble, that all that cheap money came out somewhere else. And where did it come out? In the subprime mortgage crisis. I give Alan Greenspan credit for being candid and saying, you know what, it turns out that deregulation is not always the right answer. And for someone who's lived a life of a libertarian, a market fundamentalist, a true believer in the power of markets, I think it's a huge step in his intellectual evolution to say, look, it's far more complicated than I realized. Deregulation is not always the right answer. So I'll blame Alan Greenspan a little bit, because Alan Greenspan really did have an ideology that he thought worked. But on the other hand, I give him credit for recognizing today that that ideology has failed him. And he's sort of groping around trying to find a substitute, which is a difficult thing to do. I would posit this. The substitute ideology is the ideology of thinking hard about regulation. Fannie, Freddie, and the CRA. Well, this one, folks, I can't put it nicely. It's political fraud. And I know that I'm stepping on some toes here today, but I want to be really clear that my point is that this is wrong, and that the right answer is that there was probably bipartisan responsibility here. In a way, this free market ideology grabbed both parties. In a way, free market ideology makes perfect sense. Look, if you have lots and lots of power, and you have lots of economic resources, free market ideology, laissez-faire, means the government isn't going to mess with you. So in the end, part of the power of free market ideology and the laissez-faire approach to financial market regulation is all about saying entrenched elites stay entrenched. Those with economic power keep their economic power, undisrupted by government, right? So of course laissez-faire ideology has tremendous resources behind it. It just follows, in terms of our constitutional republic, that economic and political power matters in lawmaking, right? And if economic and political power matters in lawmaking, then of course the status quo is going to win quite often, right? Laissez-faire is wonderful ideology for maintaining the status quo. So of course it had a lot of power. But look, I don't think you can say that the Republicans are any more beholden to special interest influence and influenced by big campaign contributions than the Democrats are. And Alan Greenspan, I think he was a true believer in the power of markets, and I would note for the record that he was originally appointed by President Bush I, reappointed by President Clinton, and reappointed again by President George W. Bush. So to the extent we blame Alan Greenspan for not regulating appropriately, that was bipartisan. So my story here today is on many levels, the system is to blame. I'm going to show you some hardcore criminals, and I'll identify those for you. But I am very, very reluctant here today to give you easy answers politically other than this is political fraud. So, okay, where did I get this from? Well, look, I've been paying attention to the subprime mortgage fiasco since at least August of 2007. That's my first vivid memory about this whole storm. And I've been reading everything I can get my hands on about the subprime mortgage crisis since August of 2007. Every single day, I go to my computer, I print out the best articles I can find on the subprime mortgage crisis, and I spend the evening reading them, because that's what I do. I'm a nerd. But I'm watching the debate, and all of a sudden this pops out at me, and I say, wait a minute, where did that come from? Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, this is new to me. Encouragement of Senator Obama and his cronies, I know there's problems with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and I'll talk about them. But those problems are deeply bipartisan. Keep in mind that from 2000 to 2006, we had a GOP-controlled White House, a GOP-controlled Senate, and a GOP-controlled House. And these problems, as I'm going to show you, arose during that period of time. But again, I think this was all bipartisan. It's inherent in the system. It's the admixture of money and law and power, and it's not a pretty sight. And in a way, I think that it's systemic. So I'm going to try to convince you today that trying to blame it on Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac is wrong, that trying to blame it on the Democrats alone is wrong, and trying to blame these risky loans on Freddie and Fannie in particular is also simply incorrect. These were not Fannie and Freddie loans. These were subprime loans. Worse than this misdiagnosis is this idea. The idea that we should let free markets reign. The idea that the Community Reinvestment Act somehow caused all this economic disruption and turmoil because it forced these sophisticated bankers to have to make loans to the least powerful members of our society. So the most well-heeled, most highly capitalized financial institutions in the world, with more MBAs than you can shake a stick at, from all the best business schools in the world, right? They were forced, they were compelled to go out and stuff money in the pockets of the disempowered by the Community Reinvestment Act. That one really took me for a loop. Well, I think this is a good overview of what happened. And if you look at 2004, 2005, 2006, and you consider the scale that we're talking about on this graph, I think what you see is a huge subprime boom in terms of lending in 2004, 2005, and 2006. And then what happens? Well, it turns out that those loans are far riskier than people assumed when this boom was occurring, and the market collapsed. And if you think about real estate values, you can think about this huge surge in subprime lending as supporting ever higher real estate values, right? In 2003, 2004, 2005, we're going from $25 billion per quarter in subprime lending to as high as $160 billion per quarter. So I think this graph is very informative, but keep in mind the scale that we're talking about. These years, 2004, 2005, 2006, these were huge years, giant surges in the volume of subprime lending, and it necessarily, all that capital flowing into our residential real estate market necessarily pushed real estate values up. So you can see where the real estate bubble evolved in response to this enhanced capital infusion, and once the capital dried up in 2007, that's when the real estate market began to collapse. The other thing that I think is very interesting about this particular slide is the way that it shows that there were regulators. Sheila Bair, current head of the FDIC, Edward Gramlich, former Federal Reserve governor, who were pushing for regulation of the subprime loan market. They were pushing for best practices set of standards. They were pushing for some kind of regulatory response to this boom that you see up here, and they were constantly getting shot down by Alan Greenspan. And again, you can hardly blame Alan Greenspan. He's got his ideology, and he thinks it gives him the right answer. It's a knee-jerk reaction. I'm against regulation. I'm against regulation. So regulation doesn't happen, even though some powerful folks, Gramlich and Bair, are recognizing as early as 2000 and 2001 that something needs to be done to deal with the issue of predatory lending practices in the subprime mortgage market. This, I think, gives you a very vivid picture of exactly what caused this fiasco. If you look at the subprime chart on the far left of that slide, you will see a red line, and that's the delinquencies in the class of 2006 for subprime mortgages. And you will see that the level of delinquencies are mind-boggling. This red line to me, and this is an IMF graph, this red line to me seems inexorably headed to 50% default rate. Now, no bank can survive that kind of default rate in a substantial loan portfolio. And the reason it can't is because that default rate will wipe out all their interest earnings, and they will have to charge off all their capital. Banks exist because their assets yield more income than they pay to service the cost of their capital on the liability side of their balance sheet. They are leveraged institutions. They have relatively small capital cushions. And if you get this kind of default rate in your loan portfolio, you're dead as a bank. It really helps a lot if your assets earn more than your liabilities. And it really helps a lot if you have some capital. This kind of redlining that you see right here, class of 2006 subprime mortgages, is death to financial institutions. And this is the toxic stuff that our financial institutions, our most sophisticated financial institutions, have consumed. And this is the kind of stuff that now they want us to buy as taxpayers. And we are heavy purchasers of these toxic assets. I like to refer to these toxic assets as mortgage smoothies, because essentially what the packagers do is they take a blender, they pour lots and lots of mortgages into the blender, put it on high speed, and then pour it out to investors in little cups. And those mortgage smoothies were poisonous to our financial system, and now we're drinking that poison too. As taxpayers, the U.S. government is buying billions and billions and billions now of these highly toxic assets in quotes, right? And you'll note that in 2007, class of 2007, that's this black line, guess what? Default rates are still increasing. Notice that these 2007 loans aren't even 10 months old yet. So you're seeing 30% defaults inside of a 10-month period. That's some really reckless lending. Really reckless lending. Note also that this catastrophe in the subprime market is starting to affect Alt-A, which is not quite prime, but it's not subprime either. Different scale here. This goes up to 18%. So this red line in Alt-A seems to be headed to 20%. And in the class of 2007, possibly even higher than that, maybe 25%. And then what happens? The collateral backing even prime mortgages collapses because real estate values collapse nationwide, and that leads to defaults in the prime market, right? Even if you look at the class of 2007 prime loans, you're getting all the way up to 2% default rates, only 10 months out, which is much higher than experience would suggest, right? So what you have is a catastrophe here and contagion here and here. So the question becomes subprime loans. Who's making subprime loans? Here's some bad guys, folks. These are the top subprime lenders in 2006. Remember the prior graph. The class of 2006 was that red line. These are the folks who originated the most subprime loans in the class of 2006. You can see that there's some names missing there. Fannie Mae didn't originate any subprime loans in 2006. In fact, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac don't originate subprime loans. Never did, never have. These are the subprime lenders that are at the root foundation cause of the catastrophe in the subprime mortgage market. Now, a couple interesting things about this list. First of all, a lot of these folks are no longer in business. A lot of them went bankrupt because the business model was unsustainable. Second of all, Countrywide Financial, one of the biggest of the big, right? Third largest subprime mortgage lender, have been sued. Countrywide was sued by the state of Illinois. It was sued by the state of California. And the reason it was sued is for outrageous fraud in connection with the origination of subprime mortgages. They didn't disclose the terms to the borrowers. They paid commissions to their lending officers that were based on how expensive a loan was, not on how safe it was. They lied to borrowers about the payments. They lied. They took these loans and then they securitized them into the world financial market, and they lied to the people who purchased the loans about the income of the borrowers without the borrowers knowing about it. Now, do we know if those allegations by Illinois and California are true? Well, I used to practice law, and I used to represent defendants, and I used to represent plaintiffs. This suit was filed in July of 2008 with the allegations that I just summarized to you. It's now been settled for $8.4 billion. When you sue, Countrywide was purchased by Bank of America. When you sue Bank of America, it's not like get in line and we'll cut you a multi-billion-dollar check. They pay as a last resort. And for them to pay that quickly, that huge amount of money, means that these state attorney generals had very valid claims, and they didn't want anything to do with a jury trial on this one. So when you think about villains in the subprime mortgage crisis, and you think about who originated risky loans, because that's the language that Senator McCain used, funding and originating risky loans, right? It's not Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac that originated. It's this list of banks, many of which have now failed, and many of which have been sued for engaging in consumer fraud in connection with subprime mortgages. So, okay, that's step one. These are the originators. Step two, the originators sell the loans to securitizers. The securitizers package the loans together and then sell them in various incarnations into the global financial system. Well, again, here's your list of bad guys, because these are the people who fraudulently sold packages of loans into the global financial system that ultimately brought our system to the brink of financial collapse. And that's why financial markets are so dysfunctional today. So who are we talking about here? Well, in 2006, Deutsche Bank was $28.6 billion in securitizations of subprime loans, and their default rate, as of September 07, was 23.8%. So I guess it could be worse, right? You could have been an investor in one of Deutsche Bank's securitizations, because if you were an investor, you essentially got wiped out here in terms of what you got on your investment. Notice that here we have Morgan Stanley, we have Merrill Lynch, we have Bear Stearns, Lehman Brothers, Goldman Sachs. All of these are investment banks. These are not depository institutions. That means they're not even subject to the Community Reinvestment Act at all. What happens next? Well, the subprime mortgage market begins to squeeze out Fannie and Freddie. Fannie's purple, Freddie's blue, Ginnie Mae, the smaller GSE, government-sponsored enterprise, is bright blue. Private label is the white. Remember our target years, 2005, 2006, 2007, right? That's when the most toxic mortgages were originated and distributed throughout the global financial system. Well, Fannie and Freddie's share of the market is declining in advance of those very, very, very reckless lending years. Fannie and Freddie is pulling back. What's happening here is that the private label securitizers, that list of securitizers that we just looked at, are beginning to dominate the market, right? In addition to that, this blue line at the top of this graph is the amount of private label mortgage-backed securities that are subprime. So these subprime securitizers, instead of just securitizing normal mortgages, are becoming ever more reliant on securitizing subprime mortgages. Again, squeezing out Fannie and Freddie, who doesn't do subprime securitizations. So, okay, final point. We've talked about who originated them. Answer, not Fannie and Freddie. We talked about who securitized them. Answer, not Fannie and Freddie. Well, who were the investors? And that's hard to find really good data on, but this is a pretty good proxy for who was investing in subprime mortgages. This is the list as of August 2008. July 2000. Wait a minute. Performance since August. Yeah, this is August of 2008. So as of August 2008, this tells you what investors are taking it on the chin because of loan losses. And what you see up there is Citigroup at $50 billion, Merrill Lynch at $50 billion, UBS $40 billion, no Fannie and Freddie, right? Fannie and Freddie did, in fact, buy subprime loans. And the amount that they bought led to losses of $14.9 billion. If you put Fannie and Freddie together, by the time they were taken over by the U.S. government on September 8, 2008, they had accrued $14.9 billion in losses. Well, look at where that puts them, folks. That puts them at about the level of Morgan Stanley. If you put Fannie and Freddie together, they're about where Morgan Stanley is, at the bottom of the list of losses from real estate write-offs, right? But if you take a look at Fannie and Freddie's losses, those losses were related to subprime and all-day mortgage assets. Turns out that Fannie and Freddie only bought AAA rated mortgage tranches. So when this mortgage smoothie was put together and doled out in cups, the cups that Fannie and Freddie would buy were AAA rated. So really, what it comes down to is that Fannie and Freddie weren't left holding much in terms of subprime mortgages, and they were cutting back during the peak years, during the go-go years. So here's Fannie in 2006. Their total retained portfolio was only 61% subprime. 25% was all day, 13.8% was prime. They cut back the next year, sold most of their mortgages, went from $122 billion to $76 billion, and particularly cut back in the subprime part of their portfolio. Fannie Mae, 2005, 2006, 2007, if you look at between 2006 and 2007, their portfolio was from 46.4% to 33.8%. So Fannie and Freddie are cutting back at the very time that the worst of the worst loans are being made. Why did Fannie and Freddie buy subprime? Why did anyone buy these loans, right? A lot of it had to do with pervasive fraud. For Fannie and Freddie, there's a specific Federal Register order where the Bush administration basically required Fannie and Freddie to step up their purchases of subprime mortgages. Now look, Fannie and Freddie were not the best run businesses in the world. I'll stipulate to that. They had huge corporate governance problems. Amazing stories I could tell you about how rotten corporate governance was at Fannie and Freddie. In addition to that, Fannie and Freddie were undercapitalized. They should have had larger capital cushions. That too was a problem at Fannie and Freddie. In addition to that, Fannie and Freddie had an implicit guarantee from the federal government. That should have been either explicit or no guarantee at all. And that ambiguity caused problems in the markets. But none of these problems had anything to do with risky loans being made. None of these problems had anything to do with the subprime mortgage surge that led to the real estate bubble crashing. None of this had anything to do, in other words, with the major part of the catastrophe that we just looked at in these graphs. So I don't think this was a good idea that the Bush administration told Fannie and Freddie to step up subprime mortgages. Other law professors agree with me. Patricia McCoy has written on this. It was a huge, huge mistake. That just pumped more capital into a very unregulated market that has turned out to be a disaster. Hard to argue with that analysis. Banking professor Michael Barr has testified to Congress that for HUD to be indifferent as to whether these loans were hurting people or helping them is an abject failure to regulate. I agree with that too. But the point I want to make here is this. Fannie and Freddie, although they bought some subprime mortgages, they were relatively low-volume purchasers of subprime mortgages. They didn't originate any. They didn't securitize any. And consequently, I think you should conceive of Fannie and Freddie more as victims than as perpetrators of this grand fiasco. In fact, between 2004 and 2006, they cut their market share of subprime purchases in half. 2004, subprime mortgages weren't so bad. 2006, they were a nightmare. At that point in time, they cut back from 48% to 24%, and the reason was that they had tougher underwriting standards. So Fannie is actually pulling out of the market at the time that the market begins to melt down. So, okay, I took another look at the best arguments against Fannie and Freddie. And I said, what am I missing here? Because, I mean, for a presidential candidate to get up in a debate and get the major economic challenge of our time dead wrong was disturbing to me. So I started going around to the websites of conservative think tanks. And what I found was this basic argument. It's that, look, the problem is that Fannie and Freddie was putting money in early on, and so all those big banks like Citibank and Merrill Lynch, they thought that these were good products. And it was a signal to the market that it was okay for these very sophisticated large financial institutions to purchase subprime loans based on Fannie and Freddie sort of acting as a signal, right? And I thought to myself, a signal? Citibank is going to like jump off a cliff because Fannie and Freddie jumped off a cliff? Hard for me to accept. And as I thought more about signals, I said, I'll tell you what the signal was. The signal was that Standard & Poor's and Fitch and Moody's rated these things AAA. So I decided I'd look into how these came to be AAA rated debt instruments. Well, I pulled this out of congressional hearings that were recently held on the role of credit agencies. And you've got, I don't know how this works, I guess it's text messaging. It turns out that when you text message someone, it never goes away. So keep that in mind. I don't have this problem because I don't text message anymore. But if you do text message, I advise you to consider the fact as lawyers that the record is there forever, right? So you should be careful what you text message, I suppose. Anyhow, Congress got these transcripts from the text messages of S&P ratings officials. And they're talking about a specific deal here. And they're saying that the model doesn't capture half the risk. How are we going to rate it? We shouldn't be rating it. And Official 2 says, look, we rate everything, because that's how we get paid. When we rate, we get paid. When we don't rate, we don't get paid. It could be structured by cows, and we would rate it. So in terms of signals, I think the problem at S&P, Moody's, and Fitch was highly problematic. So here's Moody's. Moody's, a quote from a senior officer at Moody's. We sold our soul to the devil for revenue. That's something I don't say much. I don't have much revenue, number one. And number two, I've never sold my soul to the devil. Let's hope, this is an S&P official, let's hope we are all wealthy and retired by the time this house of cards falters. These guys knew this toxic mortgage smoothie stuff was poison. They specifically saw the risks of this kind of a meltdown, and they rated them AAA anyhow. And why? Well, Jerome Fons, notice, former managing director of credit policy, told Congress that there was a race to the bottom, where Fitch and S&P and Moody's each wanted to get the revenue from these deals, and so their standards became more and more lax until they were at a point where the agency with the lowest standards got the deal. So if you want to talk about signals, if you want to understand why it is that all this capital was flowing into subprime mortgage instruments and subprime mortgage derivatives, the credit agencies are a very good place to point your finger. Much better than Fannie and Freddie. Because as government agencies, I find it hard to believe that Citibank and Merrill Lynch and that other list of people who got huge losses from all this group, right, would rely more on Fannie and Freddie purchasing this stuff than they would in terms of the rating agencies and the AAA rating of much of these things. Moreover, if they were really relying on Fannie and Freddie, then certainly these huge banks, Citibank and Merrill Lynch, they're smart enough to know that this kind of shift is happening. This material is publicly available. If they wanted to find out if Fannie and Freddie was still buying subprime mortgages in 2006 and 2005, all they had to do was look it up. Inside Mortgage Finance is the trade publication. They give you this data once a month if you subscribe to their information source. And so whatever signal they got from Fannie and Freddie's initial purchases is certainly gone by 2006. Let's talk about the problems with GSEs a little bit. I think that this slide shows that, maybe the Democrats were closely tied to Fannie, Freddie, Ginnie Mae, the GSEs, right? But it was bipartisan. And I think Representative Davis, the Republican representative from Virginia, hit it right on the head. The Clinton administration tried to reform the GSEs. They were rebuffed by a Republican Congress. The Bush administration tried to reform them. They were rebuffed by a Democratic Congress. I was sort of startled to find this out because given that McCain is blaming everything on Fannie and Freddie without basis, I would be surprised that his campaign manager worked for a firm, owned a firm that was on retainer $15,000 a month from 2005 until August. That blows my mind. And that Freddie secretly paid a Republican consulting firm $2 million to kill legislation that was in fact killed in the Senate that would have regulated and trimmed Fannie Mae. So if you want to blame things on Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, I think it's hard to get Fannie and Freddie as a key cause or a prime cause or any material cause whatsoever for the subprime mortgage catastrophe. And the problems that Fannie and Freddie spawned, whatever problems you can lay at their door, I think was the result of this mixture of money and politics that worked in a bipartisan way. So, okay, real quick, the Community Reinvestment Act. Well, here's the text of the Community Reinvestment Act. It's been in place since 1978. Hard to say that an act that was enacted in 1978 would cause this crisis 30 years later. I mean, what happened in 1984? Why was there no subprime mortgage crisis in 1984? Well, the reason is a couple of things. First of all, this act only applies to national banks, depository institutions, and savings and loans, right? If you go back to the list of people who were originating this stuff, very few of them were banks or savings and loans, which is who was regulated by this. Secondly, there's nothing in this act, folks, that says go make really silly loans that are very high risk. In fact, to the contrary, it specifically says that these loans have to be made consistent with safe and sound operation of the depository institution. So, okay, let's try to figure out how many of the subprime mortgage loans were originated by institutions that were regulated by the CRA. Again, Michael Barr, congressional testimony, 20%. 80% of this market was not regulated by the CRA. This idea that CRA loans, Community Reinvestment Act loans, are subprime, are a cause of these subprime mortgages doesn't withstand scrutiny. If you look at Barr's NYU Law Review article from 2000, there was a study done by the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve found that CRA loans were just as profitable as non-CRA loans. They didn't lead to an excessive amount of loss. The only thing the CRA requires a bank to do is to try to service the community where they're drawing deposits. That's it. And they should do it consistent with safe and sound banking principles. So there's no reason why banks would make unsound loans based on the CRA. It just doesn't follow logically. You don't go to jail for violating the CRA. You don't get fined for violating the CRA. The only enforcement mechanism of the CRA is that if you have a bad CRA record, you might be turned down for a merger application. So this idea that the CRA compelled all this reckless lending is pure nonsense, I think. Maybe they did it to be nice, right? It wasn't exactly the CRA, but they felt like they had an obligation to lend money to the most disempowered parts of our society. Well, when you read a quote like this, it's hard to say that they were doing it to be nice. Chuck Prince was the CEO of Citibank. The Financial Times asked him, aren't you worried about what's going to happen when all this cheap money dries up? And he said, look, when the music stops, things will get complicated. That would be today. Everything that you're seeing now, those would be the complications. But as long as the music is playing, you've got to get up and dance. We're still dancing. Well, why do you have to get up and dance? Why do you have to get up to dance? You get up and dance because CEO compensation from these subprime loans went through the roof. And in the 5 years prior to the meltdown in the subprime mortgage fiasco, Wall Street's big five, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, Lehman Brothers, Merrill Lynch, right? Those five paid more than $3 billion to their executives. Now, I am not against paying executives for performance. The problem is you pay executives for destroying global finance. And when you look at what has happened here, I think that's where we're at in terms of corporate governance. Merrill Lynch paid its chief executive, Stanley O'Neill, $172 million. Merrill Lynch doesn't exist anymore. Bear Stearns paid its chief executive $160 million. They went bankrupt. Prince loses $56.4 billion for Citigroup. It's a severance package of $68 million. You know, if I got paid $68 million in severance package, I'd resign my law professorship. CEO O'Neill loses 51, and I wouldn't even destroy the law school. CEO O'Neill loses $51.8 billion for Merrill, walks off with $161 million. CEO Kane, $60 million. Fold makes $500 million in 14 years. That's a lot more than I make. So, does deregulation work? Well, one of the things that we did is with the Securities Exchange Act of 1934, we imposed net capital requirements on securities brokerage firms. And in 2004, the Bush administration's SEC repealed that law. And it allowed these Wall Street firms to leverage up to 33 to 1. That was the leverage of Bear Stearns. For every $1 of assets, they had $33 in liabilities. That kind of leverage can really juice up your profits for a time. But if things get bad, that kind of leverage, that debt structure will destroy your company, and that's exactly what happened to Bear Stearns. In fact, every one of these firms that was relieved of the obligation to maintain that capital no longer exists as an independent firm. So I think that the lesson you have to learn is that you cannot just knee-jerk deal with regulation. You can't just say that all regulation is bad or all regulation is good. You have to think about regulation. And I was supposed to leave more time for questions, and I'm leaving here real quick. Once you talk about what the causes aren't, you begin to reflect on what the causes are, right? Too much leverage in our financial system, too much predatory lending with no regulation, too much deregulation in derivatives markets. I would refer you to Professor Cummings' articles on that. Too much incentive for risk for CEOs, lots of risk today, juice up the performance of the company, get a big bonus, company dies, right? Too much deregulation and liability, especially for loan originators and corporate managers. We've taken tort reform to an extreme in terms of corporate governance. You basically can't sue a director for breach of the duty of care in a publicly held corporation anymore. We abolished that. Very hard to sue for securities liability anymore. Private Securities Litigation Reform Act of 1995, which was bipartisan, by the way. These, I think, are serious issues that require serious thought. The worst thing we can do, in my opinion, is to misdiagnose this problem as being we need more laissez-faire. Because if we don't fix this problem this time, my fear is 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, this problem with deregulated financial markets just gets bigger and bigger and more ornery, and then we can't avert a collapse like we narrowly did this time. I think this is a huge issue. We need to have serious thinkers attacking this issue, and I don't think now is the time to be recklessly pointing at the wrong people as the cause of this crisis. So with that, I'll open up for questions. Yes?
I know New York's Attorney General, I think, I can't pronounce his name. He has attacked AIG for their compensation to some of the executives that they kicked out. I was wondering, how does he have authority to do that? And I mean, this is just a straight up question, no political implications. And how can we get some of that compensation back, if taxpayers are investing, and is that even a good idea, considering it was a contract and potential liability?
Well, I think the answer is that AIG is a New York domiciled insurance company. I'm pretty sure of that. Mm-hmm. And that gives him his jurisdictional basis. I'm not really worried much about trying to get back the $10 trillion in losses as a result of this debacle. But we have to get incentives right going forward. And managers need to understand that they can't just crank up the profits today with no regard for risk tomorrow. And the liability is a way that I know for sure they understand. Because when I was a board member of a collateralized bond obligation fund, it's something that came up all the time. And if you want to get directors to direct and managers to manage prudently, you have to restore some semblance of liability. The current no liability regime is an abject failure. Does that answer your question? Yes.
So wouldn't it be more prudent to just institute the liability back, so that way if companies do something of this nature, then you can actually go after them, as opposed to turning around and regulating them? Isn't the problem that there is no accountability for the managers, not for the companies themselves?
Yeah, and in fact, one of the things I told my class yesterday at Loyola was that I could do a 5-page legislative enactment that would do wonders for getting incentives right. And the first sentence on that 5-page enactment would be the Private Securities Litigation Reform Act of 1995 is hereby repealed. That would restore securities law, private enforcement, to where it was from 1934 to 1994. Now, if you think about 1934 to 1994, it's hard to come up with a crisis of the magnitude of the subprime mortgage crisis or an Enron-like crisis, right? I consider that good regulation, because what you're doing is you're giving the victims of fraud the ability to recover for their losses. And you're creating incentives in the boardroom and at the corporate level that says, I better pay attention to what the CEO is doing, because if I don't, I could end up being sued for securities fraud. And what's the regulatory cost of that? That costs the government nothing. So I think you're right. When you think about regulation, it doesn't have to be costly. It can be smart.
I'm sorry, guys, but we are, in the absence of time, everybody has class at 2, and there's a class in here too, so we are actually out of time. But I'd like to thank both Professor Ramirez and Professor Cummings for